Welcome to the History Unplugged podcast, the unscripted show that celebrates unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed our world. I'm your host, Scott Rank. By the rude bridge that arched the flood, their flag to April's breeze unfurled, here once the embattled farmers stood, and fired the shot heard round the world. So, James, you think Emerson captured the epicness of Lexington and Concord? Was it as epic as you think he painted it?
Well, in hindsight, yes, it certainly was. And even at the time, people realized, okay, things just got ugly. This is the first time we've had a real exchange of fire between colonists and British regular troops. You know, you'd had the Boston Massacre, but anyway, it's not really a massacre. 5 or 6 people were killed, but that was just the British firing into a crowd. But here now you have Colonials firing back. We had for 10 years, going all the way back to the Stamp Act, we'd had a lot of kind of a propaganda war going on. You know, we'd had a lot of protests, a lot of letters being sent, a lot of pamphlets being printed in America, but we hadn't got to the point of armed conflict yet. So I think even at the time, well, I know even at the time, people realized, okay, it's getting serious now. This is not a good thing. We're having well, some people thought it was a good thing, but we're going to see this has a galvanizing effect on a lot of people. However, it is not the point of no return. In hindsight, we look at this as the beginning of the American Revolutionary War. But at the time, nobody thought, okay, well, this is going to be a huge war that's going to last for years and years, and tens of thousands of people will be killed. It was not seen as that climatic of an event. So the answer to your question, I'm kind of being a weasel here, but yes and no. I'm being a politician.
Yeah, it's sort of like what Frodo Baggins says about the elves. Do not go to the elves for wisdom, for they will give you both yes and no as an answer. And this is really the act of a historian. Clear-cut answers are never really that clear-cut. And I think this gives us a chance to look at the American Revolution through the eyes of the colonists and the British themselves. They didn't know what direction this was going. Many of them didn't assume total war or independence. Maybe some dreamed of it, but many others simply thought, let's keep the status quo, but turn it into something that's just a little bit better for ourselves. For colonists, that would mean no taxation. For the British, that would mean more taxation to fund the empire. One aspect of the shot heard around the world that I think is accurate, I don't know if Emerson intended it, but when he talked about the shot heard around the world and the reverberations, he keyed into the unique culture of American media and American sensationalism and journalism. And I'm glad to say that it was right there at the beginning. So one founding father that we really only know of because of his beer, Samuel Adams, he's, I think, underrated. He was very important as a newsmaker and some would say a propagandist. And he really has impact here after Lexington and Concord. So what Adams did was produce a fictitious and very inflammatory account of British behavior during the expedition, and you can go back to the previous episode to hear about that. But what he described was women being pulled from their beds and driven naked through the streets, and men are being butchered without mercy, and poor people, the colonists, are just being exploited left and right by the cruel British. His account makes it to London quickly. General Gage, he didn't know about the Adams report, so he produced his own account that was pretty neutral. He just says that casualties were heavy on both sides. He just wants to give an accounting of what happened. So Gage's reports didn't do anything to counter Adams' allegations, and this shocks people in Britain. There's actually money raised in England to aid American wounded and widows and orphans. The British are already losing the propaganda war, so there's American journalism right there at the very beginning, ready to spin things the way it needs to go. But we're not going to keep dwelling on Lexington and Concord. We're going to get into Bunker Hill. So, James, set things up for us. What's happening in the colonies at this point?
Okay, so before we get to the battle, let's talk about a few developments that are going on in between Lexington and Concord and the actual Battle of Bunker Hill. So, after the conflict at Lexington and Concord, again, it's kind of, to call those battles is really kind of over glorifying it, especially Lexington. But The colonists began to divide into loyalists, and loyalists wanted to remain a part of Great Britain. Even some of the people who had been protesting were loyalists. They had no conception or no desire, whatever, of being independent from Great Britain. They wanted to stay part of Great Britain, but they just wanted their rights. They wanted, as you mentioned earlier, the taxes to be reduced. They wanted the power to govern their own affairs to be restored. But you also have patriots, and again, the word patriot is a loaded term. When you think of somebody who's a patriot, you think of them as a good guy, right? You think of them as somebody who is loyal to their country, or you think of the football team. Boo. Anyway, sorry, Boston people, if you're listening. But anyway, we're going to use the term as just a technical term for somebody who wanted independence. We'll use it. Sometimes we'll use it synonymously with Americans or even with colonists. Although those terms they're not all exactly the same. There's some overlap, but a patriot, as we use it, will be somebody who wants independence. And at first, there's not really that many people that wanted independence, but the number is going to grow as developments unfold. New England militiamen had closed off the port of Boston to British ships, and they're gradually beginning to surround the city of Boston. We talked about that previously, how in 1775, Boston was almost an island. I guess it bears repeating, Scott, that it was shaped. I use the analogy like a ping pong paddle, although it's not a perfectly round ping pong paddle. It's a ping pong paddle that the Cookie Monster took a bite out of or something. Cookie. Oh, not Cookie. But anyway, sorry. Yes, I did have little kids at one time.
Yeah, I know the C is for Cookie song. It's all good.
Yeah, me too. Mine grew up though, Scott. But anyway, so the Boston is on this ping pong paddle like piece of land, and it's connected to the mainland just in one place, which is like the handle of the paddle. It's a neck, and then it's surrounded on land on about, if you think of 360 degrees, it was probably about more than half of that, 200 degrees, 270, not to get too mathematical there. But anyway, so the British in Boston are beginning to feel a little bit hemmed in. Now, meanwhile, on May 10th, 1775, another very important development occurs, and that is the meeting of the Second Continental Congress. We had talked about the First Continental Congress before, which met in 1774, but that one only met for a brief time and then dissolved. And one of the last things they agreed was to meet again in May of the next year, that would be 1775, to survey the situation and to see what needed to be done. Well, they had no idea back in 1774 that there would be bloodshed on both sides. So now the Second Continental Congress has a big job to do. What are we going to do? How are we going to handle this situation with conflict breaking out, armed conflict in some places, British soldiers coming over and all that? What are we going to do? And this Continental Congress, I will go ahead and just say this Congress is actually never going to dissolve until they are relieved later by the Confederation Congress, but more on that in the future. So the Second Continental Congress that begins meeting in May 10th of 1775, they are essentially going to be the American government for the next several years. And this first group that met as the Second Continental Congress, and by the way, the membership of this Congress is going to constantly vary. People will go home, new people will come to replace them. But this first meeting, this is kind of like a who's who of founding fathers or an all-star team, the dream team. It's got Benjamin Franklin. It's got George Washington. It's got Thomas Jefferson. It's got Jefferson may have come a little bit later. I'm maybe a little fuzzy. I can't remember things like I used to, but it will have Jefferson before long. It's going to have John Adams, Samuel Adams, and a lot of other people that if I said their name, people would recognize them. They meet in Philadelphia, just as the first one had, and they meet in the old State House, which we now call Independence Hall. And when they met, the battle at Lexington and Concord was less than a month old. Now, within this Congress, some representatives, for example, John Adams and Samuel Adams, they wanted to declare independence from Britain. They were ready to cut the cord. Let's go independent now. But at this time, the majority did not want this. Although a lot of them, their opinions are going to change very quickly, relatively quickly, like within a year, give or take. So that's the Second Continental Congress. Do you want to add anything, Scott?
We've mentioned this before, but it's similar to the Civil War, where the drive for emancipation doesn't become universal until much later in the war due to other things that are happening. Some of them culturally, some of them politically. There's a definite movement there. And those who were patriots, it was pretty small. I think it was something like 30%. I don't know what time of the war, but don't think of World War II where all of society is mobilized for one common cause. It's very different. But something else before Bunker Hill, I know you're going to touch on Fort Ticonderoga, but as you go through this, here's something I'm curious about. Things are very chaotic in the formation of the nascent, not even existent United States. Washington was named the head of the army. Was anyone directing Fort Ticonderoga? Did it just happen? Is this a headless monster, the U.S. military? What's going on?
Yeah, let me touch on that. I'll first introduce it by saying that Fort Ticonderoga was a British fort. It was in upstate New York, and it was near Lake Champlain. It was lightly guarded at this time, and it was in a state of disrepair. And so you're saying the question was who was in charge? Well, there were actually two different groups that kind of at the same time independently decided, gee, I think I'll take Fort Ticonderoga. That would be, I think we can have it. It's not very well guarded. Why not? Let's give it a shot. And they were led by two different men, both of whom had huge egos. And one of them we're going to talk about a lot throughout the course of this series of podcasts. The other, not so much. But so there was a colonial militia group led by Ethan Allen, and they were called the Green Mountain Boys. Ethan Allen, I think he was a colonel in the militia, and he wanted the fort. But there's also a fella named, here we go, Benedict Arnold. Yeah, we should have Benedict Arnold theme music. There you go. Can you remember that, Scott? And just every time I mention that. Or we could have our listeners take a drink. That could be one of your cues to throw one back. But anyway, both of these men wanted it, and they came together. And they at first, neither one of them was going to give in to the other as far as who's going to be in charge. So they kind of agreed to co-lead the expedition, and they decided, well, we might as well. We want the same thing. We can do better together. So let's work together. And so they do. And they went up to the door and knocked on the front door and said, surrender. And the man said, oh, you wish to surrender to me? Very well, I accept. No, I'm just kidding. That's from the Princess Bride movie. But so anyway, the guy says, okay. So he surrenders to these two militia units, one led by Arnold, one led by Allen. And the important thing is that the capture of the fort gave the colony several cannon. I've 78 in all. The counts are different depending on your source, but roughly 80-ish cannon of different types fall into Patriot hands, and also many other needed supplies as well. And then Benedict Arnold and Ethan Allen took control of all of Lake Champlain, as far north as Fort St. John at the northern end of the lake. So they're extending their control. Arnold, say what you will about Arnold, but he was a man of adventure. He was a man of action. He liked to do things and to conquer and to take things and to fight. He took 150 men. He captured a 70-ton British sloop at Fort St. John, which is just 20 miles south of Montreal. And he sailed it back to New York. Not bad, huh?
Go ahead. Finish your point and I'll follow up.
I was just going to say Arnold financed most of this campaign out of his own pocket. He was a fairly wealthy merchant by this time from Connecticut. He put forth 1,000 pounds sterling, which today would be a lot of money, but back then it was a princely sum out of his own money to help pay for this campaign. So Arnold and Allen captured the attention, of course, of the powers that be down in Philadelphia, the Second Continental Congress, as well as they get George Washington's attention. And again, at this time, Washington is just one of the representatives in the Continental Congress, but of course that's going to change pretty soon. So again, we'll hear a lot about Arnold. Arnold's going to have a lot of adventures, a lot of triumphs, a lot of daring do, and he's really probably the most swashbuckling character that we'll see. And I keep thinking of The Princess Bride. I think about the Dread Pirate Roberts, you know, the Man in Black, Wesley. Yeah, kind of like that, I guess, but no mask. And so we'll hear a lot from Arnold. Ethan Allen, not so much. I'll just